Good afternoon. We're only 5 months away from an event that can set the path to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The Conference on Financing for Development is an opportunity to address the so needed reform of the global financial system to correct and enforce this path. From my internship with the NGO platform Forus, I worked closely with the CSO FFD mechanism, and by identifying the key issues, we realized that in every one of them, the Global North is falling short of fulfilling its promises. The current official development aid is not enough to achieve the goals in time. And while only 17% of the 2030 agenda is on track, the threshold of 0.7% of the gross national income is complied with by only 5 out of the 32 members of the OECD DAC, the ones who currently rule the system. And it is fair to say that the results of the COP29 were far from what was expected, with developed nations refusing to provide the amount of funds requested by the Global South. This is why the Seville conference is a great opportunity for both donors and beneficiaries to work together to build a structure that enjoys more universal participation and, therefore, legitimacy. In this sense, public development banks can potentially fill these gaps, funding transformative projects with a more direct relation with the beneficiaries. But most of these institutions need improved equity, inclusivity, and independent accountability mechanisms. This is to avoid financing unsustainable projects or even political repression. And the debate should also focus on the methods of allocation, considering we are in the middle of a global debt crisis. The current context requires favoring grants over loans and new negotiations for debt relief and restructuring. And lastly, the importance of transparency, accountability, and countering tax evasion and avoidance must push ambitious tax reforms to find solutions to respond to the global debt crisis. To discuss this and more, we have Paola Subacchi, who will be moderating an incoming shareholder share in sovereign debt and finance from Sciences Po. We have Javier Fernández, a student of the Master in International Development in PSIA. Rémy Rioux, Director General of the Agence Française de Développement. Pascal Saint-Amans, who is a partner in Brunswick and advises on policy and regulatory matters. Vera Songwe, she is the founder and chair of the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility. And Thierry Watrin, lead of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa's Sustainable Debt Coalition, and Sciences Po professor of climate diplomacy. Thank you all, and this excellent panel that surely shares my call for a more equitable global financial system and will help us answer how can we best prepare so that goals are set and promises are kept in Seville. Thank you very much.
Good evening, and welcome to the first sessions of this Youth and Leaders Summit. It was a wonderful name, and I like all your sweatshirts, red, and this big sea of red sweatshirts. So the road to Seville, so is the Financing for Development conference that will happen in Seville in Spain in late June this year. Work is already underway, and to build proposal, commitment, and consensus. And again, finance, as we heard from Andrés, financing for development is a big issue. And a big issue, Andrés told us, for 2 reasons. One is because of the commitments not quite met, and the resources that are needed to face the long-term challenges that we all face. First of all, and most of all, climate change. And the UN has been very clear that there is a serious risk of not meeting the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So what can we do? We have a very prominent panel here, and Andrés mentioned and presented all the panelists. We have only 3 here. The other 2 are virtual somewhere in the sky. I don't see them on screen, but Vera Pascal are joining us virtually. So I hope the technology will make the...
Good evening,
and
yes.
hello, Pascal.
Okay. I'm in Barbados. It's sunny, it's midday.
Don't tell us.
Good evening. I'm not in Barbados. I wish I was.
Hello, Vera. So where are you, Vera, tonight? Or whatever is the time zone you are in? No.
I'm in Oslo.
Oh, in Oslo. Also not too far from here. Anyway, we're going to start with a round of questions. And the first question I have for our panelists is, again, about the commitment. So it's very clear. The numbers are very clear. We are under target. And so let me say there have been a total spending in development assistance of about $224 billion, so a very considerable amount of money. But this is only 0.37% of the donor's country gross national income. It should be 0.7%. So there is a gap here. And so let me turn to Rémy Rioux and asking, first of all, what can we do to ensure then donors, and in particularly advanced economies, or if you want to say the global north, keep up with the commitments to international development assistance?
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's good to be back. It makes a long time in Butmi with all of you. So I know now my role in this discussion. So I'm the CEO of AFD, the French Development Agency. So my first point would be, of course, to say how official development assistance, ODA, is important. Of course, remind the commitments that were made repeatedly. Recognize the distrust, yes, that is attached to this commitment not being halfway met. I would say that's the figure you mentioned, and of course inviting all of you, especially these days, because you know we have a discussion at the Parliament tomorrow, and they will decide what's the budget for the development policy for this year, and so that's a challenge, that's a discussion, and we all can play a role. I'm trying myself, believe me, very hard to serve ODA, to implement ODA, respecting what it means in terms of international justice. So that's my first point. That's why AFD was born and what AFD was doing. But my second remark, and maybe to open the discussion, is to say, no, the figures are not that clear, Paola, not at all. For a very serious reason, which is we added new commitments on top of ODA now. ODA was born in France, in Paris, 1961, when the DAC at OECD, Matthias Cormann was born. So we invented ODA somehow and refined it over time. But we added another commitment, and it was in Paris, and it was in 2015. And of course, from what was decided in 2009 in Copenhagen. This is climate finance, meaning we are trying to finance not only, I would say, solidarity for the poorest, but also the fight against climate change, global commons for all of us. And you know there's this figure of 100 billion, which is different from the figure of ODA. And now, after the COP29 in Baku, we have two figures, not one. 300 billion, which is the new mark from the 100 billion, and 1.3 trillion, which is the second target that was decided by the parties at UNFCCC last year. Then to make it even more complex, you can add what was decided in Montreal about biodiversity. So there's also a target for biodiversity, how to finance the protection of nature. And then if you want to have the whole picture, you can also add what we phrased, and I was the negotiator in the Paris Agreement in 2015, Article 2.1c, which is we have to transform the whole financial system and turn it towards sustainability. So the point is, what is the right figure? I mean, what's the right target? And you know, all these targets are somehow overlapping. And poor ODA is somehow the only global public policy around. So overburdened by new targets all the time. So and my last point is somehow it worked. So of course we are not where we should be, but if you look at the last years, including in France, where we significantly increased to reach 0.55 of our GDP in ODA, and we met our commitment through AFD on climate finance. All these numbers increased. So ODA is 225. It's the highest mark ever. And climate finance, I mean, okay, it's not enough, but we satisfied the commitment that was made 2 years too late, but we satisfied the commitment that was made in Copenhagen. So what do we do out of it? Of course, what's next step? That's the question. And we see, to be frank, maybe all these targets I'm referring to are becoming way too complex. And it makes it very difficult now to explain your own taxpayers, your own constituency, what it means, actually. And so my feeling and my experience, again, in my responsibility right now, is we are losing people. We are losing people. And so we need to reinvent, and that's what Seville is about. We had to reinvent a new framework, hopefully as comprehensive as we can, so that people understand, and people are more ambitious, and people are pushing their representatives at the political level to do more.
Rémy, you just gave a wonderful answer, because there are so many interesting points packed in your 4 minutes. And then I hope our audience will be able to follow and unpack. But let me say, first of all, difficult to estimate and difficult to assess and decide and come up with targets that are meaningful. And then again, a very important point you made is the public policy dilemma that many policymakers in advanced economies face in how to justify using taxpayers' money for international assistance, and is a political as well as policy driven debate. But we'll come back to that. So the point is, but resources are needed, and we know that the challenges we have requires investment, long-term investment, again, particularly in climate mitigation and so on. And I take your point, it's very difficult to estimate. There have been a number of studies that try to estimate how much we need, and I don't think there is a consensus on that. But we need quite a lot of financial resources. And Vera, I turn it to you because you have been doing a lot of great work exactly in thinking how we can mobilize these resources with some innovative proposals. So I can see you on the screen, and now the floor is yours, and I know you can't stay with us for the whole sessions, but please.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Hopefully it's coming across well enough. I'm getting it in.
Yes.
For putting this together for the whole. fantastic opportunity to bring both, the youth into the conversation, because this is the future. We are kind of thinking about what's going to happen in the next part of the century, and it's over to you to make those decisions. I also want to thank panelists and Rémy for all the work that the Rémy is doing, of course, to put in the resources. Listen, we just report with Mariana Mazzucato talking about the justice and yes, the aid side needed for climate. But what
Vera, sorry, the connection is not good, and we can't quite, and the camera is also not particularly good. Okay, maybe you can, if you can turn off your camera and just stay on audio, maybe that will improve maybe get more bandwidth.
Okay, I'm in Norway, so, but okay. Let me do that. Is that better?
Yes, it is.
So what I want to say was 80% of the emissions are coming from the G20. A lot of the conversations around the COP been around sticking to the national determined contributions, the NCQGs. If we could get to a point where we had leadership with the G20, and that the G20 economy are able to meet their NDC targets, I think that even the resources that we need for the rest of countries is going to drop. And this is a very important point, because we are in a very difficult macroeconomic environment. In France, in the United States, in Germany, in Japan, resources are scarce. And so probably the easiest way of doing transfers will be that 20 economies, or even 7 economies, meet their target. And through this, with innovation and technology, they can bring down the cost of adaptation and mitigation for the rest of the world. And I think that able to meet the target for the G20, and we take examples of how the cost of solar panels have dropped substantially because there was investment in that, or the cost of battery storage has dropped.
Vera, I'm sorry, we can't still is not good, the connection, and I don't think your message doesn't come across clear, and I think it's a connection, and I don't think, perhaps we can pause a moment and I can turn to Javier, and maybe, I don't know if there is any way to improve the connection and leave to our technicians. So, sorry, Vera. Javier.
Yeah, so
we heard a bit about these mobilization of resources. Unfortunately, we couldn't hear more from what Vera was saying. But over to you, because you have some interesting ideas on what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Hello to all. As Mr. Rioux just said, numbers on ODA, the numbers on climate finance are not so clear, but still we're far away from the estimated 4 trillion SDG gap that was estimated by the United Nations. So there's still $4 trillion that should be committed to fund the SDGs, and we're just 5 years ago. And it's clear that public money, it's not going to take on the challenge. If we look what is going on in the world, Trump just arrived at the White House and stopped all foreign aid budget. In France also, 2 weeks ago, there was a vote in the Senate to cut development aid by 35%. And it's just some examples. In the current state of constrained public finance in the advanced economies in the global north, it will be very complicated to mobilize the necessary commitments on ODA, the necessary money from public sources. So already in 2015, when the previous Financing for Development conference took place in Addis Ababa, the international community decided on how can we actually find different sources of revenue other than this public finances. There were other calls for improving tax systems, where I'm sure we will address further down the conversation. And another key source of finance that should be mobilized to actually fund these SDGs is private finance. Private money that is out there that could be actually leveraged and properly mobilized to finance the SDGs was already highlighted as a key at the Addis Ababa conference in 2015. We saw this commitment of the World Bank to mobilize billions of public money to trillions of private financing through an instrument called blended finance that is just using public money to mobilize all these patient international private capital that was out there. However, when we look back at what actually happened, we see that it hasn't been successful. The blended finance approach hasn't worked as it was expected. Billions haven't been turned into trillions as the World Bank expected. If we look at actually the numbers, for every $1 spent in lower middle income countries, $1 of private capital has been mobilized. If we turn to low income countries, it's even worse. For every $1 of public money mobilized, it's around $0.37, $0.4 of private money that have been mobilized. So it's not been enough, and there are a couple of reasons for that. This approach hasn't been bold enough. Lower risk countries or lower risk projects were prioritized. Also, the private sector didn't have the interest of committing to these investments because the returns weren't enough for them, in spite of these blended finance guaranteeing the investment with public money. It hasn't been enough. When I worked back in Germany and the German Chamber of Commerce, we tried to promote German small and medium companies to invest in the African continent, and offering them the different range of solutions like blended finance guarantees by the state, and still they were very wary of that because they didn't found in the African continent, in this case, sufficient returns for their investment. They also looked for workforce that they didn't see there, so it has been very complicated to mobilize this private capital. So far, blended finance in total last year, in 2023, was of 15 billion, and we look at 4 trillion SDG funding gap, so it's not enough. But, however, this private capital is key because, as I said, public money is not enough. So, looking back at what was decided in 2015 and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which recognized already private capital, we should now focus in Seville how to better actually mobilize private money and how to better use private money that is out there. If you just look what happened to NVIDIA 2 days ago, it just lost 600 billion in market size. So 600 billion is a lot of money. It's half of the public external debt of the entire Africa, and it just does it in 1 day. So the money is actually there. And we have to find better ways to mobilize this money and maybe forego the blended finance approach that clearly hasn't worked.
Sorry, just to clarify, do you think then private capital hasn't been used enough and in an effective way, or do you think that is not working, basically?
So there's two sides.
Your point is...
My point is that the efforts at mobilizing private capital, both investments and also loans, hasn't been as successful as it was intended to be. Billions to trillions hasn't happened. And I still think that they have a role to play and that it will be important. And we should find better ways other than this blended finance approach of de-risking investment project by project to actually bring the money to where it's needed.
Okay. And also, if I may, we can even say, well, the private capital shouldn't be the plaster on the problem, and there should be, again, a mobilization of public money. And we heard before from the OECD Secretary General that there is now a coalition for taxation, so again, for a number of reasons, and the G20 and the G7 are committed to improve the taxation systems. And again, the preparatory work for Seville says very clearly that national taxation system need to be improved, and loopholes at the international level needs to be closed. And then there is finally, after several years, I think there is a consensus on this point. But let me bring in Pascal, and if I hope the connection from Barbados will be better than from Oslo. And Pascal, you have done a lot of work on taxation, and perhaps, I mean, we will be very keen to hear your thought on and your insight on this point. So how to mobilize more public money through better and more effective taxation system and fair taxation system.
Thank you. I hope it's working now. Is it working on your end better?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'll go. I had to cut the sound, turn off the sound on my end, so I'm glad it's working. Listen, thank you very much for this. I wanted to start with a quote of Trevor Manuel. Trevor Manuel, who was the finance minister of South Africa back in 2004 at a UN conference prior to, a Financing for Development conference, said, how do you spell aid? TAX. And that was already the announcement of what you find in Addis Ababa as the domestic resource mobilization agenda. So what can you do to fund the sustainable development goals? We've talked about ODA, great job of French AFD, of many donors, but you can see the tensions, you can see what is coming, or actually no longer coming from the US. So you have a serious issue there. You can do private-public partnership. You can try to mobilize private money. You have serious risks. I'm here in Barbados. I'm advising the Prime Minister, Mia Motley. You know the Bridgetown Initiative and how it is designed to mobilize further money, in particular by reforming international financial institutions, but also by reducing the cost of capital for energy transition investment in the global south, but that's not going to make it. So as a tax guy, because I was the head of tax at the OECD for 15 years, I have to come to the third pillar, if you wish, of domestic resource mobilization, which is what Trevor Manuel spelled as TAX, tax. What you need to look at here is, in terms of facts, the fact that precisely African countries have a tax to GDP ratio around 15-16% on average. The OECD average is at 35%. I'm not saying that everybody has to be a high tax country. We don't really know what's the right level to ensure your development, but it's above 15%. It's above 7% in Nigeria. It's probably around the 20%. That's where countries should go. And to go there, they will have to mobilize their own resources, in particular the tax resources. And here you have a tension, because it's very unpleasant for the South to hear from the North, well, you know, we may reduce aid and therefore collect your own taxes. That's not the right speech. But on the other hand, it's a necessity. So developing countries, the South in general, will have to mobilize more resources, which means more taxes. And international tax is one aspect of that. The unfairness of the international tax framework, which has largely been fixed but not completely been fixed, is part of the issue. I wouldn't join activists or NGOs saying, oh, it's all because all that was done at the OECD. I did it at the OECD with a real concern of developing countries, and that the UN would have the magic recipe. International tax can be fixed only by unanimity, by consensus, by having all the countries, in particular the large countries, as part of the conversation. Great progress was done by making an end to putting an end to bank secrecy, by fixing what we call base erosion and profit shifting of multinational companies, by trying to establish a global minimum tax of 15%. And we saw that one of the executive orders of President Trump is to dismantle it, or to try to harm it. We need to do better work on illicit financial flows. I co-chair a group of the Africa-Europe Foundation to promote the fight against illicit financial flows. But the truth is that the big amount of money is on domestic stuff, on VAT, on better tax administration, and on better tax policies. And I think focus should be brought there. In Addis Abeba, there was the Addis Tax Initiative, where donor agencies said we need to direct more money towards tax administration and tax policy. And I believe it's a necessity which shouldn't be an excuse to reduce aid. So that's where we need to be very careful in phrasing that. Very last word is that we have the alignment of stars in a sense. I mean, not the US stripe flag and the US stars. And unfortunately, this one will be missing. But we have South Africa chairing the G20. It's the last presidency of the first cycle of the G20. It's the first time an African country chairs the G20, and it's the annual, the decennial conference on financing for development. So I believe and I hope that there can be an effort to support the developing countries in mobilizing their domestic resources with effective tax policies, which, and that's a great benefit, which can reinforce the accountability of government. So government is more accountable when it spends people's money rather than when it spends foreign aid. Thank you very much. I hope it was easy to hear.
Thank you, Pascal. It was very clear, very interesting. And again, it's important to say this is really, it took a long time to build this consensus. It's not, and again, all this work, and there is a lot of work, and Rémy, Rioux can be a testimony of how much work is done behind the scene to reach consensus on commitments, on pledges, on what to do. So now there is a Simpson, we're going to Seville, at least there are some clear directions, at least on how to mobilize resources. But Antonio, Thierry, you lead the Coalition for Sustainable Debt. So once we get the money, what do we do? And again, how do we ensure then we get the right instrument, tools that are appropriate for the fiscal needs of countries, and then countries can manage these inflows of capital for, again, good and effective outcomes, and sustainable in obviously environmental sense, but also in financial sense.
Thank you, Paola. Can everybody hear me? Does the mic work? So good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. I know it's 7 p.m. Everybody is tired and it's late, and I know you're burning with questions, so I try to be fast and impactful. So as Rémy said, the figures of ODA are not clear. When the figures are not clear, you have two possibilities. Once you wait for the figures to be clear, or two, you take action. Currently, we stand in a world which is a turning point. Not of words, but indeed in action. The commitments are clear. The UN calls for 0.7%. Only 0.37% was met, as Paola just said. Rémy was talking about the 100 billion that was committed. Now we have new commitments, 300 billion, 1.3 trillion. So the question is really, how do we move from a passive point of view to an active one? To see targets and understand them as initiatives that do not close gaps. Like, we've talked the talk, it's time to walk the walk. Waiting is not a strategy. The challenge is not anymore how much we fund, but how purposefully developing nations can use the funds. So there are two strategies on which we can build. The first one is mobilization. Pascal was talking about the 16% tax to GDP in Africa, and the fact that the Seville, Road to Seville Zero Draft gives the floor of 15% tax to GDP. So why is tax to GDP important? It's the capacity to collect taxes. Everybody hates to pay taxes, but at the same time, when you use your roads, infrastructure, you're happy that you can go on public transport. As well, state is not a household. So states use tax collection to make the budget. and as well to take on debt. And the capacity to reimburse the debt, to make the debt sustainable, depends greatly on the capacity of the state to reimburse, so the capacity of the state to collect taxes. And at that, France is great. It has a 44 tax to GDP percent. And having Africa still at 16% still prevents African countries to take on more debt and to finance development. Second, multiplication. When you're in a fiscally constrained world with fiscally constrained numbers, figures are not sure, what do? You take what you receive in terms of ODA and you try to multiply it, or at least make it impactful. The SDG financing gap stands at $15 trillion. The global financial industry controls 400 trillion. Javier was just talking about it. Money is here, right? The question is, how do we bridge these 1 to 1,000 factors? Because most of the time, countries need for climate millions or hundreds of millions, whereas it needs billions. The world needs trillions and receives only billions. So you see there is always in this 1 to 1,000 factor. One of the ways to go is to use public finance as a catalyst, leveraging each dollar to attract diversified investment. So you have the example of green and blue banks. CEO Rémy can talk better about it than me, because AFD has put on money to finance those kind of banks. Then you have the rechanneling of the IMF SDRs, so the special drawing rights. It's like pot of money that countries have put in case of crisis. For now, it's still money that is idle, and you have discussions on how to rechannel the money for useful purpose. And last but not least, you have public-private partnership, and you have institutions like the International Chamber of Commerce, where the SG will be speaking, I think on Friday this week. It will be an interesting one. How can they push or facilitate the development of private sector? Pascal was talking about a tension that we see. I believe that one way to move out from this tension is to rethink purpose for development.
And again, rethinking purpose for development is exactly one of the key issues that will be discussed in Seville. In the preparatory documents, there is a chapter exactly on how we improve development. So it's not just how we find the financial resources, but how we can be more effective and how we can ensure that the development action is not too fragmented, there are not too many institutions try to replicate what others do, there are not too much overlapping. So again, being effective in developing this financing for development. But let me go back to another point that Andrés made in his presentation, and Andrés said the multilateral development banks can fill the financing gap. And this really is a critical topic, and again, one of the topics which will be is discussed right now and will be, key in Seville, is how we can mobilize the international multilateral development banks, and how the international financial architecture can be reformed to fit for purpose, exactly the point you just made, Thierry. So I turn to you, Rémy, as the head of this I got I need
finance in common.
Finance in common, which brings together these institutions, and again, it's a way to provide more resources, but also be more effective in the deployment of these resources.
So before explaining what could be this new global financial architecture that would be at the scale of what we are discussing, of what we are facing, inequalities and climate change. To make it short, let me just come back to the previous discussion. We are missing the right framework. I'm convinced about it. That's what I was trying to share with you. This addition of somehow overlapping, competing frameworks makes it very difficult, well, to head an institution like AFD, and makes it very difficult to explain to you what we are doing. So I hope, and I will slightly differ from Javier and Thierry, and maybe Pascal, that Addis was not what we need. Actually, I was in Addis for the negotiation of this the finance conference back in 2015, and the timeline was not right. I mean, in 2015, we started with finance. Then we went to New York in September. I was there to agree on the Sustainable Development Goals. And then in December in Paris, we agreed on the Paris Accord. We should have done it the other way around. We should have started with climate, because we know climate is the urgency. Climate is the driving force behind the whole transition, international and national. And then we should have turned to SDGs, because SDGs is about climate plus all the social and economical transformation that is attached to climate change. And then last, the third moment should have been Addis. Should have been, okay, now we know the urgency, we know the ambition. What is the financial, what is the finance we need to do that? And since we did it the other way around, and I clearly remember because I was a negotiator in Addis, I mean, in Addis we were only thinking about Paris. So we said, okay, we need a conclusion, I would say whatever the conclusion is, so that it helps on the way to what was the most important piece in 2015, which was the Paris Agreement. And so, of course, I'm not saying we have done nothing for a decade. We did a lot, I think, a lot of experiences, a lot of discussions, but it hasn't yet crystallized into a one and single narrative, a one and single accountability mechanism, a one and single ambition, vision. And so, again, it makes it very difficult to implement. Of course, we are proposing for Seville a framework. So we are publishing papers, many of us, including at AFD. And we try to see, there's a first paper that was published, I think, a week ago from the UN. So you can have a look. It's not a bad one, not perfect, but, and to come back to what Pascal said, it starts, the first part of the document is about domestic resource mobilization. So the message is, okay, stop thinking about a solution that would come from the moon, that would come from abroad. Start by mobilizing your own resources. They can be taxation, like Pascal was saying. It's also about mobilizing investments, public and private, in your own financial system. Okay, that's first. Then think about how international cooperation could complement what's happening in your own country. And here, and that's where maybe the draft conclusions are not, for me, satisfactory. We should have something that reconcile climate and development, because in the end it's the same. And I totally disagree with the billions to trillions motto that the World Bank proposed back in 2015. We do not need billions to trillions. We need billions and trillions, which is not the same, and which is what happened in Baku, actually. 300 billion, 1.3 trillion. Because we need to finance what nobody's financing. So we have to make it very clear. We need public finance to finance what the private will not finance. I mean, the health sector, the humanitarian, the loss and damage, there are so many issues where we know from day one that there will never be private finance, or at least for a moment, the time maybe the markets happen. So, and of course, it's extremely important to explain the most vulnerable countries that they will have a guarantee that they will never have less than a certain amount. So a bit something that would derive from ODA. But ODA including climate, meaning the amount of money we need for the most vulnerable, I mean the poorest and those that are the most affected by extreme events linked to climate change. That's the fight Prime Minister Motley in Barbados is fighting for. Because Barbados is a bit too rich, but of course, typhoons, all year long destroying infrastructure, and they have no access to existing World Bank or AFD instruments. So that's a bucket of money we need to finance what nobody's financing. And then, and this is what we're missing, AFD should be allowed to use, I don't know, 20% of the taxpayers' money we receive, or 30%, I mean, it's a political decision, to work with private. And with, of course, a sort of multiplier, so hopefully trillions, through guarantee, first loss, whatever, bond issuance to mobilize private finance and turn it to sustainable investment. But because, of course, this framework should be guided by the quality of investment. I mean, we have to demonstrate that it's turning green and not brown in terms of investment. And I think if we set the right framework, the right narrative, and the right incentives, maybe then what Pascal is wishing, meaning global levies, increased taxation, would happen, because we would clearly know what these resources that we will not spend for something else. I mean, our own health and education, or our own investments in our own country will benefit. I mean, so that's one. That's on the framework, the narrative, and your question about the public banks. We need, in front of this framework, we need to have a machine, an architecture, again, that is way bigger and way more efficient than the one we have for now, which is highly, I would say, fragmented for now. And so, yes, we launched back in 2020 an initiative. We launched it in Paris during the Paris Peace Forum that is called FIX. Let's fix it. So it's Finance in Common System or Summit. And the idea is very simple, gathering all the public development banks in the world. So you know the MDBs, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, but they are very precious. They are our platforms, common platforms, but they're very small. They're very small. It's about 200 billion US dollar investments a year. So we're far from the figures that were mentioned in the discussion. But there are about more than 500 national, sub-regional, local public development banks in the world, which are the peers, I would say, the same family. They have the same mandate, SDGs, and they are about mobilizing domestic resources. And we have to think at all of them as a system, and then work on the division of labor, on the articulation between, again, what you are doing in your own country, with your own resources, and how this is connected with international platforms and resources. It's a way also to have the buy-in of the countries in this discussion, and stop the pointing fingers at, oh, this is an international issue. This is not an international issue. It's about our own transformation in each and every country. And so I invite you to pay attention to, we will have the 5th edition of this, I think you will be there, of this initiative in Cape Town. So the point made by Pascal, the first meeting of the finance ministers and central bank governors So now with the CEOs, the 530 CEOs of the public development banks in Cape Town, 26 to 28 of February, so that we see if together, again, we can set the right framework and make the right architecture work for global commons.
And the meeting is, Rémy, is the G20 finance ministers. So, and this year, G20 are chaired by South Africa. There is...
Just to illustrate, we know it in France. We have a very big public development bank, you probably know, which was created after Napoleon stole the money of the French people at the beginning of the 19th century. So it was created, we had a king after Napoleon, an emperor, and he created an institution that is called Caisse des dépôts et consignations to protect the savings of the French people and transform them into infrastructure, let's say, long-term investment. And now it's at the heart of our fabric in France for more than 200 years. And you can find the same kind of institution somehow in each and every country in the world. So the idea is really to make a network out of them, align them, connect with international institutions, and align them with this mandate I was trying to describe before you, to finance what nobody's financing, and to mobilize like never private finance.
Thank you. It's incredibly rich. There are many issues in your intervention, Rémy. I will pick some again. Interesting is financing what others do not finance, and in particular the private sector, because the private sector, obviously, they don't finance. It's not a charity. They're not for the good and the best, but is a for-profit activity. And a for-profit activity then can be harnessed for the good of this world, but obviously the aims and the priorities are different, and also the cost of capital, because the risk is different. But there is also an aspect which is concessional finance, which is the one that is given at non-commercial rate, a favorable rate, and that is again the role of the development banks. So they obviously is not money given for free, but at more concessional way. So we got different levels. But again, I'm turning to you, Javier and Thierry, together, because I'd like you to give a sort of a quick answer. For you, Javier, is on the private sector, exactly. Okay, they don't finance they are very specific and very picky about what they want to finance, and so how we can harness that. And you, Thierry, is more the role of concessional funding and, again, grants, because grants make and are an important element for developing countries, but not only. I mean, I'd like to think the EU, Next Generation EU, is actually made of grants and concessional finance, and that's a way to fund long-term development and infrastructure in the EU. Very quickly, and then we can turn to the audience, and hoping, and I think there are some burning questions. Javier, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. So we've raised different important points here, and if we actually want to increase the participation of the private sector, what I said before, the approach so far was a blended finance of offering guarantees, as Mr. Rioux just said, of offering first loss capital to companies to invest. It was the approach that has been followed so far. It's been a project by project approach. So companies that wanted to invest came to the national governments, to the public development banks for these different mechanisms, and it has been too slow to uptake. And also different, on top of that, if you look at different countries that need the investment, especially in the global south, especially developing countries, you will find a lack of really investable projects to invest in, to actually call for the private sector, because even if they are willing to put the money, there is not the sufficient pipeline of projects to put the money in. So that is another thing that we have to consider, and also fundamentally for companies of the global north, especially of other countries that want to invest, in a country of the global south that that suffer under a lot of currency variations, that is also some very important consideration for private companies that think of the currency volatility. And if they think, I'm going to invest in the local currency, but in 1 year time, 2 year time, I don't know if my investment will be valued, will have lost the half of its value because of this currency valuation. That poses an enormous risk that also have to be addressed if we want to increase private sector investment. There is precisely one of the advisors to the Prime Minister of Barbados, Avinat Persaud, that has come with different mechanisms of how we could actually guarantee these currency exchange volatility through precisely similar mechanisms, similar guarantees to focus on that. So, yeah, if we look back at the public development banks, which will definitely be key actors, and it's not a lack of ideas, there are a lot of ideas out there. It's sad that Vera had to leave us because she actually also wrote a report on how to make multilateral development banks better, bolder, and bigger, and she could have shed some light on that. But public development banks will play a key role through mobilizing private finance and offering cheaper loans, at least than commercial rates, to developing countries. And also because especially the national development banks, Mr. Rioux was just talking about, there are lots of them in different countries. They also have the local context. They are in the countries, they have the connections, they know the political context to actually also be able to create and foster this pipeline of projects that is needed also to increase private sector investment. So, yeah.
Thank you, Javier. Before answering, there is a great book that I just read from Frédéric Ramel and Ariad, who are two teachers of Sciences Po. It's named The Word Space. For those who have not read it, it's right in the street in Sciences Po library. And it's quite interesting to understand the dynamics of rethinking the global financial architecture. I have 3 pillars. The first one is directionality, and I just talked about it. How can public finance not only repay the old debt, but drive a future growth? And it goes back with the multiplier effects we're just talking about. Then there is the integration. It's an interesting concept, and I was watching Davos intervention of Dean Arancha on how do we drive force to Europe. It was actually a very interesting conversation because the speakers spoke a lot about how do we integrate more Europe. And for those who have a laptop or a phone, you can Google it. It's on WEF website. Integration is key, actually, and we stay at a world where not only Europe, but Africa has the same issues and concerns on how do we integrate better. I'm a bit struck each time I come or I hear people putting themselves in a commenting situation, like what happens overseas, how can we comment, what's happening, etc. We need to go back to what can we do between us, at least. How do we refine trade agreements, for example, between Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia, or Latin America. Just an example, the African Free Continental Zone represents a potential increase of trillions of untapped exchange. So on the one side, you have the crucial needs of developing countries, and on the other side, you have industrial zones like Europe that needs to continue building. And the last point is the point about debt, which relates with what I do currently. I lead the Sustainable Debt Coalition, which is a group of 20 countries reimagining the role of debt. Debt is not a bad word, it's a leveraging instrument. Today you have 57% of African nations that spend more on reimbursing interest rather than healthcare or budget. So this initiative pushes instruments. You may have heard about sustainability-linked bonds that ties sustainability to development, debt for climate swaps that exchanges nature commitment against debt, and an instrument that just appeared, which is debt for climate conversion, which was issued by Barbados. I will make it. And Pascal is there, right? It's interesting. Why? Because it's not a default. It's using a concessional purpose-led. Pascal?
Yeah, I'd like to just bring Pascal, given it's in Barbados. Pascal,
Yes,
we are,
yes,
maybe you
yes,
can start.
indeed.
Sorry to, maybe you can give him the floor to him, because we have a bit of a tight deadline here. Pascal, Barbados has been mentioned at least twice in this conversation. Do you want to add something? Because it's a country that have done some interesting innovation and been watched by others as an example. Maybe you can say a few words about what Barbados is doing?
Absolutely. So,
But it
as
has to
you
be very short.
probably all know, Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, has become a voice of the South to say we need funding to address the energy transition in the world. The access to capital is too expensive for countries like Barbados. I think Rémy explained it's too rich to benefit from aid, but it still is from the South and doesn't benefit from the appropriate credit rating. The cost of capital is too high. Avinash Perso, who was the special envoy of Mia Mottley, always explains that you need a much higher return on investment in Barbados than in Germany for the same investment, even though the risk is the same. So there is something wrong which needs to be fixed. It comes also with the reform of the financial institutions, the quota, the reallocation of quota, the mobilization of funding which is available, but for many reasons was no longer available. And Barbados recently updated the Bridgetown initiative on the 3.0. It's a bit more technical. It gets into the detail of what needs to be done, but you can count on Mia Mottley to be the voice of the South, addressing the North in a pragmatic manner to ask for reforms which are needed, which will be more difficult, I think. We need to recognize that 1 week after the inauguration in the US, but which are absolutely necessary. So I invite you all to type Bridgetown Initiative and you will see all the details which are developed there.
Thank you, Pascal. The time is now, we're almost 8 o'clock. The time management has been terrible, I apologize, but there was a lot of interesting points, and you can see this is a complex, interesting, multifaceted topic, and it's very difficult to be disciplined. But the floor is now open, there are the 2 microphones there, so please come and prepare yourself and ask the question, and in particular say, keep it short, and if you have a specific question to one of the speakers, say so. We start here. Yes?
Yes? Yes, okay. I'm Marina, I'm an exchange student here at Sciences Po, and I also follow the UNFCCC negotiations with the youth constituency, so I've been following the NCQG for a few years. I was in Baku, and we left there completely disappointed, and we could see that trust was not in the room. So Rémy, when you said that we need to guarantee that at least developed countries will have this guarantee that the money will arrive, we can see that 300 billion is not enough, and this 1.2 trillion, it's basically lack of details, so we don't know how this is happening. So I had a lot of questions. This was very interesting, but I would say, what do we expect from Seville? And what signals can
Thank you. Sorry to stop there, but there is now too long queues. And actually, I take 3 questions, bundle them together, and turn to our speakers, just for the sake of time. But please keep your questions short. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Alfonso. I'm a student from the Master in International Development. And my question is, so there's the issue of DRM, but there are also countries, as you mentioned, such as SIDS, that do not necessarily have a lot of room for improvement, or it's difficult because they're too small. And they've been advocating for the use of, for example, multidimensional vulnerability indexes to sort of complement the reception of funds and aid, besides, as you mentioned, maybe graduating from ODA officially. So what's your vision on that? Is that taken seriously by the international community at Sevilla?
This is a question for the whole panel or for a specific?
For the whole
panel. Behind in that, yeah, thank you.
Caleb, first year international development, and this one is for Javier. I was wondering, you mentioned the point that the money is there, especially in the private sector, and I heard a bit about the solutions, but I'm curious to know, can you tell me more about some of the reasons why private capital is struggling to invest in these areas? Is it risks? Is it lack of information? All that. And enjoy Cape Town when you go there. It's going to be lovely.
Javier, you picked this question, then you got one for Rémy, but you need to keep it very, very short because it might take the whole night to explain the. And then Thierry, you take the one about for the whole panel. And
I didn't have any question targeted to me.
But you take the one for the whole panel, Javier.
Yeah. So to keep it very short, there were some issues I already addressed before, but I will try to keep it to 3 different points. First, there's the currency problem. If the money is lent to projects to invest in local currency, then companies, when they invest, they say, okay, maybe in 10 years, when I expect to get my return on the investment, the money I will get back won't be the one I expect because the currency has changed and currency is now half the value that it was before. So that's one of the aspects when you invest in foreign countries that it's usually complicated. Second aspect is precisely the lack of local knowledge in some cases, and also, at least from my experience when I worked with German SMEs, like the small and medium companies, with bigger companies it's different because they have much more resources, but the small and medium companies also, they struggled, or they thought at least that there wasn't enough workforce, at least sufficiently educated workforce for their sector or for what they wanted to make, so it was also a big impediment.
Thank you. Rémy, expectation for Seville.
So Seville is not the same track as Baku. So next step is Belém for the climate negotiation, and I really hope that because of Seville, because we will have a significant result in Seville, Belém could beat Baku. I mean that's my, and I think we will make it. Maybe not in Belém, but over time. So alas, my privilege is I've been in, I think, 14 conference of the parties now. So I was in the room in Copenhagen. So people were crying in Copenhagen. I mean, believe me. So there was a sense of despair in the room. It was not exactly that in Baku. So of course everybody was feeling Trump's pressure coming. So we were a bit in a hurry to have a result, which is not totally satisfactory, but, and you know how France was viciously attacked by the presidency, which was really unfair to us and to colleagues in the room negotiating. But again, I defend the result, especially on finance for what I described you, which is I like this idea that there are 2 different objectives in the way we finance the fight against climate change. And it's better to have 2 targets than only 1. And then, of course, if we can increase the numbers by 2035, that would be fantastic. The idea of multidimensional vulnerability is extremely important. Actually, there's another paper we recently published from AFD about the double vulnerability. And you will see charts and a bit of a different vision of the world and the way we could rank, because in the end it's about ranking the country. So I'm not sure the international community is ready to do that, but at least we are putting ideas and figures and images of what it could look like in the public debate, so we can pursue on that. And sorry, one last point about private sector, and to come back to the public banks. Public banks can do 2 things. Origination. So as Javier said, there's a problem. We need more projects, bankable projects, so that the private sector can invest. And it's typical market failure. So there will come a time when the market itself will develop projects. When not, you need a public component to help. That's one. And the second point is data. To best measure the real risks of a market, you need people, and the rating agencies, they don't know, they're not living in Africa. So what the market is asking is, especially to the public banks, because we are investing there, is just open your books, share your data, and then with artificial intelligence and all that, we will have a better, more precise perception of what these frontier markets are about. And this is something we have to do now way more broadly than what we are doing for now.
I think Rémy covered it. If I may, world's most valuable asset is still human capital, and I think you students at Sciences Po are the future architects. So if there is maybe one thing that makes me optimistic about the future, is that the next COPs will have more and more Sciences Po students, hopefully, to go in the right direction.
You mean the number of people in the room after 8 o'clock? That's reassuring.
I handled the question to Mark Maloney because I have a train to catch and go back to London. So.
A big hand of applause for Paola before she goes. But we're going to carry on with some questions. Well, great to join you on stage here. I think, did you get a chance to finish the question?
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. So we're on this side now. Next question, please. Again, name your master's program and very quickly a question.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks again for this panel. I'm Titouan Chalavon, part of the International Economic Policy Masters. And my question was about maybe more directed to Rémy Rioux. The IFD sometimes is criticized for its neo-colonial perspective, and I was wondering whether this criticism is true to a certain extent, and how we can empower developing economies in the decision-making of the financing decisions maybe a little more. So what could be the solutions for this? Thank you.
And then over here.
Hi everyone, I'm Upmanu. I'm doing my master's in environmental policy. So I have a very specific question related to private investments. So in the climate sector, I feel private sector investments have been very hyper-focused on climate mitigation projects rather than adaptation. Is the trend changing? And if it is not, then how can we get the private sector to equally focus on adaptation-based projects?
And the third question on this side.
My name is Fernández. I want to say thank you. I'm very pleased and proud to add a word in this conversation. I'm from the Master of International Development. I am Cameroonian as well, so thank you, Vera Songwe. I also speak French. Thank you, Rémy Rioux. My question will be, can look dumb, but is actually very personal, so I will request your sincerity. Do you really believe in development aid? I'm here for me, but the state is not representing the whole world. The state is sovereign, the state is independent, so do you really believe that another state can help to develop another one? Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Rémy, I think two of those questions probably are for you in the first instance, so why don't we start with that, and then we'll go to Javier and...
So it would take a lot of time, really, and maybe we can continue afterwards in another context to answer these two very different, these two clearly interlinked questions, drawing us back to, I would say, the history of how our institutions and the way of doing our business structured over time. I will take the second one first. So you will never hear in my speeches the word aid. So I'm no longer talking about aid. As I said, this ODA framework was structured in the 1960s, so 50 years ago, at times of the independence, actually, of so many countries after the colonial era. So again, respect for that, but who could think that a framework that dates back 50 years ago is adapted to the situation we are? So that's an obvious reason. And even the world of ODA, of assistance, of aid, is rejected by its own beneficiaries. So I mean, there's a real problem. So we have to change the wording, we have to change the framework, we have to change probably also somehow, but of course we are working on that, the way we operate. So that's and so you know President Macron, France, we propose to the international community to talk about, in French, we don't know exactly how to translate it, investissement solidaire et durable, sustainable investment. But turn to a logic of investment and partnership between equals. And you know, when I'm presenting to a foreign partner, I talk to you about Caisse des dépôts et consignation. I'm always explaining, I'm French, I'm related, I'm linked to an institution where the experience, the development experience of France has accumulated for more than 200 years, and I'm really interested in the way you are doing it. And maybe we could have a dialogue between our development experiences. And I'm so interested in your experience because you are trying, innovating, maybe for climate change before, that these innovations I'm ready to invest in. And then, of course, to bring them back in France, in Europe, and have this exchange of views, technologies, experiences that development is about. Then the point on neo-colonial, I would probably phrase it post-colonial to be more precise, because as you know it, in the French Empire, so until World War II, there was no bank. There was no transfer from France to its colonies. It was more of a, let's say, a predatory system. I mean, or at least the colonies had to be financially self-sufficient. That was the law at that time. And there was no AFD at that time. AFD was born December the 2nd, 1941, so at the heart of World War II, and it was created, it's a nice story, by General de Gaulle in London, and it was called La Caisse Centrale de la France Libre, the Bank of Free France. So it was part of the history of French resistance, and the initial capital of AFD is not French, it's African, because this is the money people took in Africa. And so somehow we say we are du côté des autres, meaning the core capital of AFD is not French. You see what I mean? And that's our role, including here in our country. So, but we are not linked to the colonial area, but true that we were an institution, part of, I would say, the post-colonial, meaning this relationship that was built between France and its former colonies after independence. So something sometimes we call France-Afrique, you know. So we had a specific role in this framework, and you know what's happening now is President Macron broke that old mold, and now we are trying all together to invent a new relationship between Africa and Europe, between Africa and African countries and France. And just I close by saying that we are doing a very serious work about our history. So we have, since I'm CEO of AFD for 9 years, I'm an historian by training myself. We have published, I think, about 15 books on the history of our institution. So on many, many aspects. And there's a work between all institutions, public institutions in France, working in Africa to do the same. So to try to reassess a bit what this period left unconsciously, I will say, in our organizations. The mark, the footprint it left in the way we are doing our business. And of course, we are expecting from our peers, from our friends, from our counterparts in Africa to do the same. Because in the end, it's about a relationship. So it takes two to change a relationship and invent a new one.
Yeah, to come back on the climate mitigation and adaptation question and the engagement of the private sector. So indeed, if you look at where private sector invests, it's mainly focused on on mitigation, and not that much on adaptation. And it's a simple reason, and it's just how the private sector works. If you think of mitigation, it offers much more present and like short-term returns on the investment than adaptation investments does. it shouldn't surprise us that actually the private investment is engaged there. So seeing this, which is like actually negative externality because the money is not going everywhere they should, there's a perfect place actually for the public sector to go in, especially through the public development banks that could not only themselves finance the projects, the mitigation projects with public funds, but also leverage in the private in the capital markets the money through the public development banks that can then be invested by the state in this sector that is clearly underinvested because the private sector doesn't want to engage in. So it's a market failure, and the state should then, in this case, through public development banks or itself, get in to correct it.
Thanks, Javier. Thierry, do you want to add something?
Yes, just to comment or to complete what CEO Rémy was saying, it's true, and it's actually a good question and a legit question about how development banks think. And in another life, I was sitting at the same table in front of CEO Rémy Rioux, and yes, AFD financed development in Africa, and money where other developers would not have gone, like the Green Bank or adaptation. On the spirit, I would say, of development, you have an interesting podcast which is done by the CEO of Pemandu. It's a Malaysian company, and he's a former minister of efficiency in Malaysia, and he invites ministers or former ministers from the Asian public sector, the Four Tigers. And it's really interesting because they speak about how Singapore, Malaysia, and South Korea made it through development, because in the 60s or in the 70s, those countries were literally developing, like there was not a lot. Yes. So it's really interesting, and you have another interesting podcast which I like on YouTube, The Rest is Politics. I believe Dean Arantxa participated to it. And it's quite interesting because Rory Stewart, who's moderating it, is a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and it's really truthful conversation, so I invite you as well to look at it.
Great, thank you very much. Let's take our last few questions.
Yeah, Annalena, a Master's in International Governance and Diplomacy. We've heard a lot about public and private finance, and I'm currently following a course on philanthropy. And while I'm well aware that the amount of capital in that sector is relatively small compared to that can be leveraged in the other two sectors, we did see foundations such as Bloomberg step in and actually finance US climate obligations. So I think my question is regarding the role of philanthropy in financing. What financial instruments and approaches such as blended finance, responsible investing, could and should be used to best collaborate with the other two sectors and improve the impact of such organizations and foundations?
Great, thank you for that.
Good evening. My name is Michaela. I'm a first year in the Master of International Development. My question is for Monsieur Rioux. So reflecting back to what you said about the Cape Town Summit and how this will set a standard or a framework for financing for collaboration among public development banks, I'm reminded of the AFD and the AIIB partnership, which was unique in that it put in motion the creation of a mutual reliance framework. And so I want to know, practically, if you had to define it, what goes into that and how that can be used to maximize the impact of development. Thank you.
Great. And is there a last question? Yeah, last question.
Okay, hello, good evening. My name is Jason. I'm studying international energy transitions in the first year. And my question is directed to Thierry and Pascal, if he's still with us, and focused on the debt for climate, debt for nature swaps, or the debt for climate conversion idea. And I want to ask if you see also especially in the context of Donald Trump being in office now, if China steps up as one of or I think the second largest unilateral debt holder to fill in the gap that the US will for sure leave in debt for nature swaps. So do you see some, maybe not new momentum, but some substitute players coming in, or is it dead in the water?
Great, thanks very much. Okay. Rémy, do you want to go first on Cape Town?
So thank you for following So it's a very precise question. I was in Beijing before Christmas, and we signed several agreements with policy banks, public development banks based in China. So I signed agreements with National Exim Bank of China and the China Development Bank. That's one, very interesting, willing to untie their financing, which would be a first in development finance. And I also signed a third agreement, yes, with AIIB. AIIB is a multilateral development bank. France is a shareholder of AIIB, but it's based in Beijing, and the main shareholder is China, like the main shareholder of the World Bank is the United States of America. It's an important milestone because it's the first agreement where AFD can delegate tasks and funds to AIIB, but AIIB can do the same in reverse, which is not the way we are doing with the World Bank, where we can only delegate tasks and funds to the World Bank. It's not symmetrical. So it's the first agreement between a multilateral institution and a national institution like AFD that is symmetrical. And it's important because in this finance in common architecture of all the public development banks, really the idea is to have the money flow in a seamless way, well, the most efficient way we can, so that the best division of labor happens. Maybe the local banks are better at originating because they know the people, they know the risks, they know the context. And maybe when you elevate at regional or global level, we should manage common tools to complement what you can do at ground level. And so this is one of the elements, having the same procedures and making the money flow way more efficiently. I remember you that this is also an anniversary this year, not only of the Paris Agreement, but also the 20th anniversary of what was called then the Paris Declaration, which was very important. Maybe you are studying it. It was the declaration on aid effectiveness. And there was a whole agenda at the early 2000 about how all these institutions, where so many now, are working way more efficiently without overburdening finance ministers in poor countries that are obliged to receive 200 missions a year. I mean, and somehow we lost track about it. And we have to have this agenda of efficiency, effectiveness back in our business. On one word on philanthropy, but maybe others will join. The Bill Gates Foundation is a G7 country. When you look at their spending a year for development, it's the equivalent, it's maybe even more than a G7. I would say a G2 or G3 country. So it has become very significant in the field of development finance. And it's important because it's grant resources. They are not financial institutions. And most of the time, I was in Dar es Salaam yesterday, co-financing of the Aga Khan Hospital for Oncology. It's a co-financing between Aga Khan Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and the loan from AFD. So we are doing blended finance, actually. And sometimes the philanthropy, the foundations, they are doing different things from the government. They are maybe coming at an earlier stage, or they are more agile, and sometimes they are not. So again, the division of labor has to happen also between donors, and we have to think and surpass, because it was in your introductory speech. I think I know this old tension between grants and loans, so I know that. But just look at grants and loans like instruments. I mean, in a dispassionate way, and reconsider what a loan is about. I mean, because a loan, it's not about finance loan. It's just about thinking that you will borrow money and you will have create value enough, maybe in 20 years, so that you are able to repay the loan. So it's really about thinking long term. And it's really about, of course, the price of time and believing in the future of your own country. And then the relationship with an institution like AFD or others is very different from a grant to a loan. Because when you know the grant agencies, when you are giving a loan, a grant, you're always managing it yourself, basically. So it's never really a grant. And it's very different from a loan, because when you are lending money to someone, you cannot ask him to manage it yourself. So the contract is clearer, and the relationship, I think, is more respectful most of the time in a loan compared to a grant. And then no country in the world has ever developed only with grants. I mean, it doesn't exist. You need to invest, you need to create value, and you need to repay your debt. As simple as that.
Thierry, do you want to comment on the debt for climate question?
Yes, debt for climate conversion. Very good question. Actually, it is a game changer. It's a new financial instrument which is almost mission-oriented in the sense that we move from a former paradigm where debt is bilateral, old, and expensive, to a new instrument which is concessional, purpose-oriented, and delivering, in the case of Barbados, in a blue economy, maritime zones. So how does it work? I will not go into the technicalities of the financing, but you have European Investment Bank and Inter-American Development Bank providing guarantees, GCF providing grants. With that, they go on the market to have a new concessional financing to repurchase the old expensive debt. And with that, their debt sustainability grows because the fiscal pressure is less important, and at the same time, provides value. It's a value-driven financing. So it is a game changer, and from the Sustainable Debt Coalition point of view that I lead in the UN, we receive a lot of interest from developing nations and emerging nations for those kind of instruments.
And there's no default, which is extremely important for the credit of the country. And it's also a way to leverage, anyway, to refinance, re-leverage towards specific investments, former debt.
Is Pascal still with us? No. Okay.
Yes, I am.
Ah, great.
I'm listening carefully to the conversation. If I may quickly, so nothing to add on the debt for nature swap. I think they are a very good instrument. They can lower the cost of borrowing. At the same time, they protect the environment. There may be some questions here and there of who's in charge of monitoring what's happening and what's the loss of sovereignty of the country. So we need to be careful in the design of these measures. But Barbados, for instance, among others, is extremely happy. Barbados did a swap on protection of the ocean. If I may just come back to a much earlier question, which was on the expectations for Seville. I concur with what has been said by Rémy in particular. We know that the US will be difficult, to say the least, and I believe that the domestic resource mobilization, as was said, is now the first chapter, will be key. That's probably an area where you can have a paradoxical convergence and maybe no divergence from the US. It may be needed, and as I indicated earlier, South Africa chairing the G20 could help the G20 have a common approach, or at least send messages in that regard, which could be useful. South Africa, we have now the African Union as a member of the G20, but the road will be bumpy between now and then. We need to see in the coming weeks what's the impact of the new US administration. And thanks for having me. Good evening in Paris. I will enjoy the beach between two meetings.
Thank you so much. And let's give the last word to the young but very capable Javier.
So yeah, I'll try to finish and wrap up with just what Pascal said. To also think what we can actually expect from Seville, which was the question that was over us the entire time. And it will be complicated to expect concrete commitments on concrete numbers, on concrete actions that will be achieved, because the conversation is much more about building a political narrative. There are already a lot of intellectual proposals, approaches to how the international financial system can be changed, how we can actually mobilize more money, how we can mobilize money more efficiently. There are lots of different proposals, lots of different ideas, and more than agreeing on concrete terms, because it's rather like a political conference where we have concrete changes. If we think of the IMF, if we think of tax, probably won't happen there on concrete terms, but it will be much rather about building the political narrative and agreeing on specific issues that can be tackled quickly. Because as we recall at the beginning of the conference, we're just 5 years away from 2030, and the SDGs were thought for 2030, and as Andrés said, only 17% are on track. So it'll be definitely a paramount moment to agree on political terms and to see actually what can be brought forward as quickly as possible.
That's great. Before I ask you to thank everyone, I just want to whet your appetite for tomorrow, day 2 of our Youth and Leaders Summit. So we're going to start, we're not in this amphitheater, we're going to be in the ones upstairs, both of them, starting with Chapsal, where we're going to start with a TED Talk on how to humanize and make institutions more compassionate. That's a TED Talk, 15 minutes on that, followed by a session in the hot seat, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, on the future of the multilateral trading system. And you can imagine there's lots to talk about given the current tensions on trade internationally. And then finally, we're going to end with a debate, the first time that we host a New York Times debate on the big question, do we still need a UN? So that's for tomorrow. But let's now give a big hand of applause to our panel this evening. And thanks to all of you for being patient and waiting right through to the end. So see you tomorrow. Have a good evening.